Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going, a weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube, back with another episode of the Games Memo. There's a few things that I want to talk about tonight. So there's going to be a lot of reading. This is a lot of stuff that I've written before during the week, but some necessary table setting before we really get into the main two topics, which I think it will actually be fairly short tonight. And I'm going to rush through a lot of this because I actually have enough to keep going here coming up in just over an hour. So thanks very much for anybody who came through in the live chat. And if the mic is too loud or too quiet, just let me know. The first thing that I want to talk through is this piece that I wrote, I guess a little over a couple of weeks ago, about on the future of gaming, or we're all niche now. This is over on my blog. On niche markets, the advantage of console is when it hits the tip-over point where people benefit at scale from mass adoption. Thanks, shout out to Warawana from the Discord I hang out, who really kind of struck upon this that particular notion. But I think the gaming market is becoming more and more a niche of niches, skinny verticals having very disparate needs and price points. So the industry will have to, in aggregate, adopt a Samsung model and cater to this highly fragmented market, because you start having problems at the ragged edges once you achieve scale that can't be spread wider by your baseline momentum. I think PlayStation is doing this by entering the next generation with a 3 SKU or potentially 4 SKU strategy. I think this is partially achieved more so on the market by the way PlayStation is catering to the high end and Nintendo is catering to the lower end. In and around them, there will be skinny spaces that can be occupied by the Steam Machine and Xbox Helix. Then other skinny verticals for cloud services and GeForce Now. Next Playground, other handhelds, Roblox. I don't think any of these any of these things takes over. So meaning I don't think there's a lot of volume and prediction that, Roblox is the way of the future and it's going to take over everything, or the next Playground is the way of the future. It's going to take over. I think a lot of those takes are very hyperbolic and not really practical. I don't think all of these things, theoretically, if you're preaching that consoles have achieved max scale and there's no more growth, as a lot of people do, then it stands to reason that all of these things have some maximum ceiling of growth. And that beyond that, they're all going to cap out, and then they're all going to kind of creep along in single percentage growth amounts once they become mature subsegments of the market. They all have their own ceiling, a quantifiable cap. No one of them has the potential to be ubiquitous. That will be the transformative thing that none of us see coming. The holodeck or games beamed directly to our brains or some such other. My money is on the holodeck. So that segment is really talking about how a lot of the predictions that go around today that, this one thing is going to be, the console killer, I think is not the case. Like literally nothing that we see today. We had this prediction with VR, right? Literally nothing that we see today will be the thing that takes over. What is the thing that will take over will be something disruptive that none of us see coming. And I think the market will continue like this for maybe a decade and a half at most. And then just like we did in the 90s, the market will swell to a point when there are too many platform suppliers, where it decides that it will no longer support this atomic fragmentation of supply and will recongeal in the more consolidated time frame that we've seen from 2000 to 2023. No single supplier can or needs to cover all lanes. And so this is my pushback on this notion of the monolithic business model or the monolithic platform, which is just unnecessary, because we have other markets that shows that that's not the best way forward. And actually, consumers are better served when there are multiple business models. You look at the desktop and laptop PC space, the mobile computing market. We are best served because there are 3 different business models, 3 different licensing models, 3 different technology approaches to the stack. You have Linux, which is the truly open platform built on open source. You have Microsoft/Windows, which is a proprietary licensed space where people can deploy code, but in order to build a machine based on that operating system, you have to license it. You have to pay for the license. It's not open. Many of the technologies are proprietary. The technologies are not open source. This is my pushback on this theme that I've seen running around a lot, that Windows/Microsoft is not an open platform. Like, I'm really surprised that Linux people don't, like, crawl out of the woodwork with sniper rifles to take shots at people who make that proclamation, because it's absolutely untrue. And then you have the walled garden, right? The vertical integration in the form of Apple. And those three models are ones that actually provide the greatest choice to consumers on the market. And it is the same with Microsoft, Nintendo, and PlayStation. The three different business models that they take to providing content, providing platform access, is actually the thing that best serves consumers. It's not the best thing for consumers for everyone to go to a subscription model. No single supplier can or needs to cover all lanes, but in aggregate, I think we'll see this effort to blanket and play more man-to-man defense during this time than the zone coverage that the industry has been playing for 20 years. So as the market has become mature and as we get more and more of these verticals, there's less and less opportunity to kind of spread wide and spread at scale in a way that covers down on large swaths of the market. We are dividing people up into skinny buckets. And even those buckets, or we're dividing people up into certain major buckets, and even those buckets have been stretched to the point where growth is very difficult for them. Growth is very challenging. Spreading that at scale is hard. And I've talked about that because there are only so many consumers that are the gamer archetype. This notion that by putting content on a screen, you're going to capture billions of people who don't want to pay for a $500 piece of hardware is actually incorrect. There's only a certain percentage of people of the entire human race that want to play video games, and I mean core video games in terms of the type of video games that are most prevalent in the console and PC gaming space. Thanks very much for Henry just checking into the chat. Here we go. Let's see, Rachie. Thanks so much, guys, for coming through. The PlayStation 2 was kind of the Series S of its era. Yeah, I'm not sure why I am not getting... crap, I just screwed something up in the live stream. Or in my Windows. And I cannot get... I'm trying to get the chat window in my OBS, and I closed it, so I'm screwing that up. So I'm going to stop messing with that. Okay, the second piece that I want to read is Welcome to the Suck. And I wrote this earlier this week. Console players meet the PC market reality. A common saying which goes around is to be successful, games need to be on every platform. The most successful games are multi-platform. These are also the ones that tend to be cross-generational. So when you look at certain types of these titles that are on a lot of platforms, they also tend to target current generation hardware and last generation hardware. If you've been playing the games that supposedly everyone plays, since a common ongoing narrative is that everyone plays certain types of games, they ignore exclusives and you believe that exclusives don't matter, that a persistent cross-generational state of affairs in a generation between console hardware doesn't have the impact some claim today. So in other words, some people are saying that because of the rising prices of consoles, you're going to get a heavier prevalence of the cross-generational dynamic in the next generation. And what I'm saying is, well, okay, but you guys have also claimed that no one's playing exclusives and everyone's playing these games. Madden, NBA 2K. I think Madden just went current generation only. But, you know, COD. So if everyone is playing those games, then it doesn't matter if it's cross-generational because they're going to have access to those same games. The bulk of the market is going to have access to the same games. And those are the games that they're consuming at scale, so the cross-generationality doesn't actually have the impact that I think a lot of people are proclaiming. So it's fine for people to have this thought now that, hey, because of rising console prices, the cross-generational dynamic is going to be greater. And so that's fine, but if you have that opinion, then you should also true that up with your other opinion that you've had, which is that cross-generational actually, is that everybody's playing cross-generational games anyway. The gamers supposedly playing all of those games, NBA 2K, COD, all the gas stuff, those players have been playing those games while held back by the previous generation. So people not upgrading to the PlayStation 6 won't impact that segment of the market as something new. They already do. Right? So the notion that people aren't going to upgrade to the PlayStation 6, and I don't know why the PlayStation 6 is the only part of the conversation, because it actually applies to Project Helix 2, which is predicted to be a high expensive platform. Right? High cost, high price, expensive piece of hardware. So if people don't upgrade to that and they stay on their Series X or their PlayStation 5, it actually doesn't matter, because all of them are at scale are playing games that are already cross-generational back to the last generation. So the impact won't actually be as significant as some people are saying that it is. On PC, this is to draw a comparison, those of us who are on the high end for time immemorial have upgraded while being conscious that we are held back by PC Potato Nation, the 86% of the market. The market slice that drives consumption of older games, non-premium games, tons of gas, isn't worried about performance, plays at 1080p, right? Granted, they have two monitors, but they're two 1080p monitors. For the 14% of us who stay on the bleeding edge in current gen tech, it is a market economy that we have become accustomed to and settled with. For some console players, it will be system shock, a bit of welcome to the suck. I see some other content creators finally getting the thing I've been talking about for years, CLV, although they don't use this term. They don't use this term because they're not familiar with it, because they're not actually trained in that domain. The battleground is the digital storefront. The console piece of hardware is the primary access point for that. You need to put it in the hands of users and give them a reason to choose yours over another competitor's. You can do that a few different ways. You can do it with differentiated content, exclusives. You can do it with differentiated and competitive pricing. So the Xbox, or, right up until the end, the Phil Spencer statement that, he wants people to buy hardware on the merits of the hardware, or exclusive access to a value service. Because we don't often talk about the fact that on console, the only place that you can get Game Pass is on Xbox. That is also a format of exclusive, which is a topic that it seems lots of people like to skate by. I've also mentioned before how other consumer electronic spaces have for a long time stopped generational MSRP cuts. This is not new to other spaces in consumer electronics. So an iPhone or a Galaxy, Samsung Galaxy, will cost you the launch MSRP the day before the new one launches, right? So if you go to buy an iPhone, literally the day before the next iPhone launches, it will be the same MSRP that it launched at. Yes, yay, verily. You can go to carriers, you can get deals, you can stack all kind of stuff if you've been a long-term subscriber, blah, 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 blah. MSRP remains the same. Products launch at the price that they launch at, and they very frequently, right, for the top competitors in the market, will stay at their price. Google, more than anyone, I think, maybe discounts the series of Pixel phones. I think more so. They definitely do incentives, right, with the carriers, but even more so because Google has its own carrier service as an MVNO, Google Fi. The discounts on Pixel phones on Google Fi are pretty substantial, right? So that's a thing that they can do because they run their own MVNO. Okay. For a long time, suppliers have kept their MSRP for SKUs until they launch the new one. Those days have come to console, and other world economic factors are leading to additional price increases. So reality, some people in parts of the market will get priced out. On PC, people have been getting priced out of the $500 budget build that used to be viable a decade ago. The era of the $500 GPU has also ended. The GTX 1070 launched with an MSRP of $379, $449 for the Founders Edition. On PC, the cross-gen market economy and value prop decision factor is an ingrained way of life. We've been dealing with that forever. But we've been also been dealing with it in greater extremities, right? Since the MSRP cost of GPUs especially has significantly increased, right? Doubled and tripled times over in the last 5 years. So none of this is to say anything is fair or justified. It is to state conditions of dynamics in adjacent markets. People will have to make choices and decisions. Maybe next gen there will be an actual battle between the market demo that puts a priority on quality versus the demo that puts a priority on low cost of access. In that world, maybe value props like smart delivery, Game Pass, Play Anywhere, and being able to access your games on a mobile device to the cloud will make a bigger difference. The console cross-gen split might start to look more like PC, right? Where on PC we have, I'm kind of swagging numbers here, but we have like 14% of the market of people who are on high-end performant PCs, and the vast majority of people who are on entry-level GPUs, X600 series Radeon GPUs, XX60 series RTX GPUs, many of them at 8 gigabytes, right? Many of them doing the bare minimum to be on the playground. So in that world, maybe value props like smart delivery, Game Pass Play, and being able to access your console. Okay. If so, I reckon the ones who decide to stay on the edge of tech and consoles will do the same as high-end PC players do today. Make decisions about where they want to play, and then make peace with that decision. Yes, people who are high-end pay a lot of money, but they find a way to rationalize that and come to peace with it. As I wrote earlier this week, the gaming industry has been on a perpetual long-term bubble for the last 5 to 7 years. If the blister pops, there will be more damage. But it also seems that the blister is not likely to heal on its own, at least not quickly and without the death by 1,000 cuts approach we are experiencing. There needs to be a market correction, and the answer to that is not less powerful hardware. As a media journalist who actually I admire and have a lot of respect for and listen to their stuff, recently suggested, suggested that the answer is less powerful hardware. No, it's not. The answer to that is not less powerful hardware, although lower price SKUs will be part of the mix. The unfortunate key answer is fewer games, and sad to say, fewer studios. Oversaturating inventory with product people don't buy, especially in the face of rising hardware prices, just doesn't make sense. And look, that's a crappy reality and a unfortunate thing to say. I have a penchant for saying the things out loud that a lot of people don't like to talk about and don't like to say because they're crappy things to say. But things could be both. Things can be true, and just because they're true doesn't mean that they aren't also sad. But we need more kind of truth in this space. Rachie says the digital distribution is a blessing. So many games are still releasing on Xbox and PS4 thanks to the low cost of entry. And it says agreed 100%. Rachie mentions the Pascal and Polaris GPU were good at value. $100 GTX 1050 destroys the Xbox One and goes on par with the PS4. And RPG88 checks into the chat. Thanks so much, RPG. Okay, another piece that I wrote on Twitter was this piece about what's really going on in the market. When we talk at volume about the AI bubble, we don't deeply analyze and voice the fact that the gaming industry has been a long-lasting, quasi-perpetual bubble, fueled primarily by irrational exuberance since 2020, and then back that off an additional 2 to 4 years for the run-up, so 2016 to 2019-ish. So back that off an additional 2 to 4 years for the run-up, increasing tremors and signs, exacerbated by the pandemic, right, and the crypto bros. This has been structurally supported by the easy liquidity of studios and the greater fool market dynamic. Irrational exuberance and greater fool are economic dynamics, particularly in luxury markets, where people are just simply willing to pay more. And while there is a large volume of discussion about people don't want to pay more, people don't want to pay this, people don't want to pay that, there is a reality that we acknowledge that is going on in the market. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But there is an irrational exuberance and a greater full market dynamic going on in the gaming market. Matt Piscatella has admitted to this and has admitted that he didn't anticipate it and that many analysts missed it because it isn't the popular thing to say. The politically popular thing to say is to say corporate greed, these companies suck, it's bullshit. But what's not the popular thing to say is, as I've been talking about for years, is that what you should do is you should look around the market and you should look at people who don't have the same price sensitivity that you do. That is an economic metric where we talk about the elasticity that's available in pricing, right, based on the demand signal on the market. And so when the demand signal is high, there will tend to be lower price sensitivity, or at least a greater variance in price sensitivity across consumers in the market. You have people who are willing to pay more when the demand is huge. And so therefore, corporations can charge more. High growth expectations not balanced by recognition of market maturity, high but rapidly shifting consumer demand, and bullish startup herd mentality despite market elasticity has led to this. And what I mean by that bullish startup herd mentality is, look, again, this is going to be a thing that's not popular to say. What we need to ask ourselves is, there are 19,000 games being produced, right, on Steam, for Steam every year. I think the amount going to consoles is somewhere around like 7,000 or in slight excess of that. 5,500 to 8,500, somewhere in there. A lot of these games aren't being bought. And if we were talking about physical products, what we would quickly arrive at is that it doesn't make sense to saturate the market with inventory that people aren't buying. That is exactly what we were doing from a software perspective in the digital space for video games. And that factor is driving some of the market dynamic, a large part of the market dynamic that's going on. And so at certain points, we need to start asking the question, at least those of us who are trying to understand the market, trying to understand the industry, we need to start asking the question, does it make sense when a AAA studio is closed down for the developers to go out and open 5 new indie studios who are going to further contribute to another, of the 19,000 games that are being produced, many of which just aren't going to be bought? And I've talked to developers in the gaming industry, and very many times I've asked them, I've said to them, look, there are, I don't remember what the metrics are now, there's some million number of software developer jobs out in tech that are unfulfilled. There are certain ones that are slightly more lucrative because you need something like some type of certificate or background investigation or security clearance. So those things will typically come with an additional salary kicker. And I say your quality of life will be better. You won't experience the crunch. You'll still experience crunch. All software development has crunch. It's another thing that a lot of people don't talk about. There's always crunch, particularly as you run up to delivery time. But you won't experience crunch at the same scale that you have, right? I go through all these things, right? Better pay, blah, 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 blah. And typically what I frequently get back from them is, well, but I want to be a video game developer, right? And there's a certain element to it that's the rockstar mentality of, I want to do something cool. We have different pockets of that, right, across tech, right? You have people who work as a software developer in a market subsegment that they morally agree with. You have people working in software development in service of their country, right, in various nations, and so they're proud about that, and that feeds right why they want to stay where they are. But there needs to be an acknowledgement that part of what goes on is that people have skill sets that would allow them to transition to, like, for all of the this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, and this is bad. There are exit ramps for some of those engineers, and they don't take it. And when you have a market, when you have an industry that's just oversaturating inventory exponentially, that creates a breaking point. And a lot of that is Western corporate culture too, and I'll talk about that at the end. But I wanted to talk about the engineering aspect of it, because I always recommend to engineers, kind of know yourself, know your career, right? Know your environment, know your space, know what's being valued, know the dynamic that's going on that's gonna drive where you can send your kids to college, right? How you pay for your house, that type of stuff. So now within hardware and services, most pointedly, within the past couple of years, we are seeing rapid cost increases without sufficient fundamental merit. As bad as this is, the fact that it is unrecognized and not talked about and other things are boogeyman for blame also leaves the industry incapable of responding. And so at the industry level, there are lots of discussions about the things that are driving what's making things bad. But hardly any of them talk about the fact that there's just too much inventory. There are too many games being made. There are too many people in the space. Again, there's a problem with Western corporate culture, and again, I'll talk about that at the end. In addition to that, analysts and pundits speculate at loud volumes about things that are not fixes and not solutions. So they talk about the answers, less powerful hardware. They talk about games need to be, multi-platform. They don't talk about the things that I just mentioned, and that's part of the problem. I think the last thing I need to read through is this last thing that I wrote today. Oh, wow, sorry, chat has been popping off. Henry says, that's personally why I was never upset about studio closures. Those people would A, go to another studio, or B, form a smaller studio, and of course, just leave the game development space altogether. One mentioned that, that there are popular things to say. Henry mentions that piece you wrote really changed my perspective on this. It says, I think they have to ask, are you making something the market wants? And that's, yeah, there was an episode, I think right before Christopher Dring left GI Biz. They were doing a podcast, maybe it was called the GI Biz Microcast, or I mean, I can't remember. But there was a panel. Rami Ismail was part of it, who's a consultant in the space who works with a lot of independent studios. There were 3 other people on the panel. I can't remember their names off the top of my head. But most of them talked about the fact that, like, when they do game jam, like they do a week of game jams, and they just have everybody like dedicated to making game concepts and prototypes, and then they decide the ones that they're going to keep and the ones that they're going to work on. And one of the things they talked about in many of these studios, publishing groups, things Rami talks about, like I think it was Rami whose actual quote was like, look, like here are the metrics on Steam, and I've talked about these at vast lengths before. You have like 8% of the games. I can't remember. Like I said, I can't remember all the metrics. I bookmarked them in the Discord, the Hangouts. So the people who are here from the Discord, you guys know where to find it. But you have something like 8% of the game of the new game revenue, which is not all revenue made on Steam, but for new game revenue, you have something like the top 8% game, 8% of the games published in a year make 92% of the revenue, leaving 8% of the remaining revenue to be gained, right, by the other 92% of the games published that year, right? So you have this incredibly upended, highly concentrated revenue generation model. And then something like, I can't remember, like I said, like 1,100 games or something like that out of like the 19,000 break like $100,000 a year. And when you talk about like what developers are making today, on the East Coast, an entry-level developer, walking out into the space commands a salary, if you're trying to make a competitive salary, can command a salary of about $85K, maybe just north of that. So when you talk about a game, you talk about the vast majority of those 19,000 games that are published not cracking 100K, that means they're not making enough money to pay for one developer for a reasonable salary. You have a lot of these people that are located out in California, so that makes it even tougher. But yeah, develop for your niche. But a lot of these people say, look, if you're not, like, here's the bar. If your game isn't targeting that bar, then why would you bother making it? And there are a lot of people who are like again, like I said, like when I've talked to developers, when I talk to like lots of the new kids coming out of school, when I interview them for entry-level jobs, so many of them say, one of the questions I ask is like, hey, if you weren't coming to work for me, where would you go work? So many of them say, I'd go be a video game developer. And I'm like, I think there's market dynamics going on that you maybe like don't understand. But yeah, Rachel mentions develop for your niche audience and watch out for the expenses. Look at Coffee Talk, they found their niche. Henry says, crunch is one of those things that are just a part of life. Even Chick-fil-A has a version of crunch right through that drive-through lunchtime, right? This sounds like the car market being driven by people who make higher salaries, pricing out the new car market, which is oversaturated with vehicles sitting for years. Yeah. I'll talk about that a little bit, about the market demographics and like where the stratification of the spenders are. Some of my favorite games on Steam only have like 10 to 20 reviews, right? So again, I'm a little pushed for time, so I'm going to push through a lot of this stuff I may not get around to chat. So this is a response that I wrote today in response to a response in a thread Brap wrote, where he went through his inflation model. And so the assertion was that Brap had made a ridiculous statement in his claim that video gaming was a luxury. And my response to that was, it's not a ridiculous statement. Economically, the math has been proven many times over. And Brap does this whole thing where he goes just through the cost of inflation and the depreciated value of the dollar, the time value of money, right, and how much things are in real dollars, right, accounting for inflation. Not a ridiculous statement. Economically, the math has been proven many times over. This is Brap isn't saying anything that isn't written in a grad level economics book, right, and has been since 1776. Right, but we act like when these things are presented that somebody has made something up, and I kind of don't get it. And and from this, and this from so I corroborated what Brap said, and I said, and this is from the perspective of someone who argues with Brap about this all the time. Brap and I don't argue about this every week anymore, but I used to. I mean, I would say we're definitely still at a state. It's kind of rearing its ugly head again because prices are increasing, right? We're still at a state where he and I argue about this every 2 weeks, right? Or 2 times, twice, 2 or 3 times a month. And what I say to Brap is that it's the apparent impact to consumer wallets and the wedge out of their disposable income that matters, not the math of the inflation. Like, look, I get it. I agree with the math on inflation. People don't care. Consumer doesn't care. Consumer goes to the cash register, and they don't care. They don't care about inflation. The same way that I had somebody argue with me that because there's the law of diminishing returns taking place in the reduction of CPU fabrication lithography processes, that the PS5 Pro isn't a good, and I'm like, dude, like nobody gives a shit about that. Like technically correct, sure, but no one cares when they go to the cash register, because we discount the notion of quality. But I'll get back to that too. That it's the apparent impact to consumer wallets and the wedge out of their disposable income that matters, not the math on inflation. But through the 80s and 90s. Consoles were not prevalent in the households of people who were not well above the median income. The late 90s, and then especially the time period of flat prices in software, particularly from 2005 to 2020, saw an influx of consoles in households penetrating from the above average middle class down to the median income. One reason you see so much complaining about the rise of prices in software when prior to 2005, historically prices rose by $10 every 8 to 12 years since the beginning of the gaming industry in the early 70s. So the beginning of the gaming industry in North America in the 1970s is earmarked by the launch of the Magnavox Odyssey, which launched in 1972. And you can go back and you can trace through this research, right? And you can see that I'm correct. I've written a piece on this several times before. So you can argue the morality or fairness of the price increases, but those are the economic facts. And in PC, we've been getting priced out of historical budget prices from the first 10 to 15 years of the century for the last decade. And I mentioned my thing about the GTX 1070 launch price. You said it yourself that people are going to get priced out. And we've been saying the same thing in the PC space for the last 4 to 5 years. There are people who came into the space accustomed to low component prices. I talked about this when I wrote my piece about RAM. Because what has been normalized for some people is paying $82 for 32 gigabytes of RAM. And when you go back through the historical trend, that is absolutely not the norm, right, in the space for RAM. There are people who came into the space accustomed to low component prices and they're getting priced out, and they're mad. So I won't get into all the other stuff. So there you have that. And now I want to talk about like really some of the issues that I think are at play, for content creators and this whole swirl of discussion that's been going on this week. Seeing if anything major is in the chat. Really, he says, facts, I'm buying it to play the games that I want to play, not Moore's Law. Right? And so here's a little bit of discussion of what's been going on this week and things that are personally bugging me. The statement that was made in the thing that I responded to was that Brad needed to stop acting like he's the smartest person in the room. And that's just one example. But in general, right, of things that go on weekly, right, in the gaming conversation on Twitter. My response to that, and just to this overall theme, is that large creators need to stop the gatekeeping. There's no reason, zero reason, for gaming content creators who have tens of thousands of followers to take a pot shot at small content creators who are not trying to do this full time, who have a regular 9 to 5, who aren't constantly on Twitter asking to like my video, subscribe to my channel, please help me get to 1,000 subs. It helps the channel out. Right? When that isn't their shtick, when that isn't part of their groove, there's no reason for large content creators to take those pot shots that are very much, I'll just call them the armaments of what I'll call the common man. And here's where I'll put some accountability, and I'll put it out in a way that says there are some people who need to step up. I say that for the large content creators because the conversation, as all of us have talked about in video games on Twitter, is absolutely toxic. It's been getting worse. And I put the accountability on those guys' shoulders because you guys have the capability of changing it. But the problem that we experience, the behavioral problem that we experience, is that every week, week in and week out, when large content creators are challenged or offered a different opinion than the one that they have, and when it is, even when it is done, especially when it's done respectfully. In this case, the comment Brat posted was his own post on his own timeline. He didn't come over to somebody else's thread, right, to challenge them. Although I think it's indicative of the character of content creators when they are challenged by a notion and they come back with these ad hominems, right? I put the accountability on large creators because you guys have the ability to change the conversation. But what happens week in and week out is that when you are challenged on some of your notions and some of your premises, some of your hypotheses, some of your theories, what we routinely get back, again, when those things are offered politely, what we routinely get back is, you're just saying that for PlayStation, you're console warring. Worse, in my personal opinion, is like what went on in this thread, which is that you make a attack on a person suggesting that there's some behavioral defect driving why somebody is having the opinion on gaming that they have. These things aren't examples of even common courtesy in a social media, but especially they're just unnecessary. Like, if you have a problem with the suggestion that games are a luxury, and they are, anybody who's an educated adult, I'm assuming, has been exposed to the notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where there are big things that are important to people at the bottom of the pyramid, and there are things that are less important to people at the skinny top end of the pyramid. Gaming is at the skinny top of the pyramid. It's not heat. It's not, right? It's not warmth. It's not clothing. It's not food. It's not security. Like, what kind of kills me on the theme of what's going on this week, especially, is this notion that these first world problems, and I'm going to take another bright point at a way in which I think character could be improved in the conversation that we have in gaming. When you are a content creator and you are well traveled, you've been outside of this country and you've gone to countries and you've seen the squalor that other people live in. And I know that there are people who come by and say, what aboutism? Right, but the fact I'm going to tell you is the Americans, especially, I'll say, who have that opinion, have a very encapsulated, right, narrow view of the world. When you haven't been to some of these countries and seen the squalor people live in, when you haven't been to the home of the person who's driving you around, right, a country, and see how they and their family live and see what they're dependent upon. And then you talk about gaming's not a luxury. I seriously, I don't understand it, but I especially know that, again, if you're a content creator and based on your background, I believe and expect that you're well traveled and you've seen some examples of some of this stuff. Like, I don't understand how you could have that opinion. But I go back to my major point is, you guys who are big content creators, and I get it. Like, I think there's a sentiment or feeling that it was done to you. But again, you guys are the ability. You guys have the ability. You guys have weathered the storm. And you guys have the ability to not turn what was done to you around on smaller content creators and do the exact same thing to them. You guys actually have the capability to be bigger people. But what I see from a lot of content creators is feeding into that toxicity, showing up on podcasts, and talking about, altercations that happen in the rap game with content creators on other podcasts. And you're just perpetuating the toxicity. We also get this when it comes to the topic of exclusives. When somebody says that they like exclusives, or when I say I like exclusives because I believe I know that when developers have the opportunity to code close to the metal and they're not preoccupied by developing for multiple delivery targets, that they have the opportunity in a project to do their best work, to run the most power out of that dedicated piece of hardware. Even if we're just talking about staggered release methodology. And when those games are good games, when those games are quality games that people enjoy, that I personally enjoy, then people have a right to value those things. But there is rhetoric and dogma that goes on today in the gaming conversation that says if you have that opinion, it's only because PlayStation, or you have some behavioral defect. Behavioral defect, by the way, is performance review talk that we use for people who are performing poorly, right? Or not collaborative and don't get along with others. We call it a behavioral defect. So my point is, there are reasons why. Again, one of the things I've reiterated is value is in the eye of the beholder, and different people value different things, and people are free to have their opinion or their belief or perspective on the things that provide value to them. I get it. Low cost of access is a priority for some people, but for other swaths of the market, quality, particularly when you're spending large sums of money, is a larger priority than low cost of access. Apparently that is the case because that is the way the market distribution has gone. If low cost of access was the one driver that drove the vast majority of the market, then everyone would be on Game Pass, and that's not the case. Everyone would be on the less expensive pieces of hardware, and that's not the case. But we don't have it. Not only do we not have it, we don't allow the discussion of what is going on in the market dynamic and the demographic of the different stratification of consumers that drives that difference. We're constantly putting up walls and gatekeeping and saying, well, you're just doing that because you're a fanboy. And I'm not saying that's untrue in some cases. In some cases it is because they're a fanboy. But the other problem I have with the carpet bombing gatekeeping is that then what you guys don't do is you don't differentiate between when person A is a fanboy and when person B is actually making a logical argument accounting for a dynamic in the market. And that's because too much of the gaming content conversation tends to be about reality TV, Survivor, taking things down to the lowest common denominator, and quite frankly, talking to people like they're not intelligent enough to understand a more sophisticated conversation. Granted, I get it. Some people don't care. Some people are like that person that I talked to at the register. They don't want to hear about, right, diminishing returns of processor fabrication lithography processes. They don't want to hear about the calculation for inflation, right? So I get it. But that doesn't mean that all of the gaming conversation should be held at that level and just fomented, right? Just made to foment outrage. Again, you guys take that defensive stance when we talk about exclusives, and you completely ignore the fact that one of the members of the $1 trillion six is entirely built on the notion that it has curated and cultivated a set of customers who prefer the exclusivity of a highly curated, totally owned vertical stack of technology. And I'm talking about Apple. They own everything from the processor up. The App Store is highly curated. As much as they can, even in the age of mass app proliferation, they try and keep that place from being a trash heap that you go into where you can't discover the good stuff. It's not like the Windows Store, which is the most extreme example, or the Play Store, I would say, where you kind of go in and there's just detritus in front of your face and you have to peel. I also put that on Steam, where you have to swim through all the refuse to find the good stuff. You completely ignore that people find that of value and that they actually spend that money, and that actually drives a huge market share winner and revenue winner on the market. Justification and causality. The other thing that went on today in that thread was there was the accusation that, Brap was trying to justify the price increase by telling people about inflation. And that's the thing that is often, again, conflated in the gaming conversation. It's typically to drive narratives around platforms. Because I say that the sky is blue because of the ozone layer, I'm not an ecologist, by the way, so I don't actually know that it's because of the ozone layer. I'm just using it as an example. Because I say the sky is blue because of the ozone layer, that does not mean that I agree with every EPA regulation that's designed to protect the ozone layer. It means that scientifically, the sky is blue because of the ozone layer. Simple. And so it means if the gaming industry is experiencing rising prices partially because of an oversaturation of inventory, too many studios, too many games, and because the gaming industry right now, actually this perpetual bubble that I've talked about is being borne by the affluent who are still buying stuff. Right now I'm getting back to the greater fool market and irrational exuberancy. That effect that Matt Piscatella has admitted that he missed, and analysts missed, that because they didn't expect things to go that way, that's a thing that needs to be discussed, but people don't talk about it. What have we made the conversation about? We've made the conversation about PlayStation raising prices is bullshit, but we haven't actually pulled it apart. Justification, in my opinion, actually only is relevant when you are in at the active throes of making a purchasing decision. There is no justification that anyone can do for a price increase unless they're thinking about actually buying the thing. People who already own a PlayStation 5 Pro, they're not justifying the cost increase. They can't justify the cost increase. You can only justify the cost increase if you're in the market to buy. But when we have sophisticated conversations talking about the causality of why those things happened, then that's not justifying it. That's explaining to people what's going on. That's explaining, like I've had to do, that's explaining to people that you need to understand when you see a cost, you see $900 for a PlayStation 5, and I'm just using that as the most recent example. Pick any consumer electronic you want. Because we hear this all the time. We hear this with phones. We hear this with subscription services. We hear this with hardware. When you say it's BS, nobody should pay $900 for PlayStation 5, you need to understand, I'm not saying the $900, like this isn't the case, right? You need to understand if there are people, you need to consider if there are people in the market who are less price sensitive to you and are going to pay that price. And why do I say that? I say that not because, not because just in casual conversation, you need to decide. You need to decide that because part of the conversation that goes on that's led by content creators often is this notion that by feigning performative outrage on social media will get companies to walk things back, or that market conditions are such that things are going to change. Market conditions are such that PlayStation is going to revisit sending their tentpole single-player IP to PC because now they've had to raise the price of hardware. The thing I mentioned this week is, let's make sure that we understand. PlayStation did not, if they have decided not to send their single-player tentpole IPs, they didn't make that decision a few months ago in the vacuum of considering whether or not they would have to raise hardware prices. That was absolutely part of the decision-making formula. So to suggest that they're going to walk it back because now they've had to raise prices doesn't really show an understanding of how the decision-making around these things goes, in my opinion. Sorry. Just the same way that, Xbox is going to consider going back to doing exclusives, which maybe they will, but the likelihood, the statistical probability is that they won't, given where they are in the market. So we ascribe to this notion of people explaining causality that's them justifying, and that's absolutely not them justifying. I've had people come to me in the last 4 years, since I got pulled into this whole swirl of the Twitter, YouTube space. I've had people come to me and say, I appreciate what you do and I appreciate the content you cover because I've actually been trying to learn about the industry, and it's impossible to learn about the industry when I'm in these podcasts with people yelling and shouting and screaming on the podcast, when the chat is absolutely horrendous and you can't really ask a question unless you do a super chat, which when I talk about the behavior of what's behind some of these models of content creation, right? Because the chat's just going a million miles a minute because everybody's console warring, or what I call platform warring. So again, we need to have these detailed, granular conversations and not do as much hand waves if we're trying, I'll say for the segment of the community who's actually trying to learn the details. I get that there's a large segment of the community that really is just about declaring the hegemony of a single platform or the superiority of a single platform, and that's great. There's content for those people and they can go watch it. But I think what needs to be understood is when there's those of us who are not having that conversation or having a different conversation, and at that point there's just no need for those two parties to intermix. So Reggie says, the whales are the one buying. PlayStation can't afford to have half of their customers base being little Timmy's playing free-to-play games and never spending $1. Yeah. So here's my opinion of what's going on this week, right? With specific regard to the PlayStation price increases. In my personal opinion, and look, I know, no offense to anyone, I'm just saying this is my thought. I know that I have friends who have covered this topic. Unfortunately, we're going to talk about it tonight on Enough to Keep Going, and I'm going to repeat the same thing that I'm about to say now about the PlayStation 5 increases. In my personal opinion, there is no discussion to be had about the price hike. The entire gaming conversation has been obsessed, occupied, monopolized by this notion of whether or not the price hike in the PlayStation 5 is right or fair, is virtuous, whatever. There's no conversation in my mind for it to be had. It's already been done. You can walk through the Monday morning quarterbacking of justification of it. Who cares? The price has already increased. And perhaps most importantly, what has gone on this week is now with the culmination of PlayStation, Nintendo, and Xbox having kind of set up table settings for what's coming down the road. There is a conversation to be had about what people should anticipate is going on next generation. And that conversation is not facilitated, in my mind, is not facilitated by telling people that the right way to respond is to rage against the machine about raising prices. Prices have increased. You now have a war going on that has shut down the Strait of Hormuz and making it incredibly expensive to transport anything on this planet that requires fuel. That is probably going to have an exacerbated regional effect that is probably not going to settle anytime soon. The real conversation to be had is about how people should respond to that, how people can respond to it. What should people be able to do? Maybe there is a conversation that some people should move upstream and go to PC. Not everybody needs to go to PC. But some people maybe should. A discussion today about whether or not people are going to be willing to pay for $1,000 consoles. Again, I don't know why we keep saying $1,000 PlayStation 6, because it's not just going to be the PlayStation 6. If it is $1,000, which I don't personally think it will be, but if it is $1,000 for the PlayStation 6, it's certainly going to be that much money for Project Helix. So I don't know why we're saying only bringing up this hypothetical with regards to PlayStation. But again, what people need to think about is people need to not think about, I don't want to pay money for a $1,000 console. People need to think about, is the market going to pay $1,000 for a console? I didn't want to pay $2,000 for an RTX 5090. I didn't want to pay $1,500 for a 4090. But guess what? Lots of people did. And people who paid the $1,499 for the RTX 4090 enabled NVIDIA to say that the 5090 is $1,999. That's the way the market works. And you can outrage about whether or not it is proper or fair or like, it doesn't matter. Like, an important element of capitalism that people are missing is the market doesn't charge fair price for luxury items. Fair price is a topic for commodities, pork bellies. Farmers charge fair prices for crops because crops aren't differentiated. But in the space of electronics, people charge the money that the market is willing to bear, which means if you want to put that in a different way, corporations charge, I shouldn't say people, because actually I rage against this notion that corporations are people. They're not people. Corporation is an entity. suppliers charge what they think the market will bear, and the other way to say that is suppliers charge what they think they can get away with. That is exactly what goes on. They calculate what is the biggest price that they can charge and remain competitive and outsell their competitor. And that is what they do. So this whole virtuous cycle of I'm gonna yell and scream and I'm gonna declare it's not righteous and it's some like religious, crime or whatever to charge a certain price for a thing. Like, again, what you're preaching to people is a inability to deal with the realities of a capitalist market. Again, look at GPU prices. And again, I go back to what Piscatella mentioned, right? And I've said for quite a long time, and I was saying before he realized that he didn't catch it, is that the affluent are bearing the market. And so the question isn't whether or not you will pay $1,000 for a PlayStation 6. The question is really, will the market pay $1,000 for a PlayStation 6? Are enough of the affluent going to pay $1,000 for a PlayStation 6 to the point where PlayStation doesn't care if you don't pay $1,000 for a PlayStation 6? Now, I'm making some gross generalizations. I think there's supplier dynamics that will change. I think part of the software development methodology is going to change in the approach that's made to how games are produced. I think there's going to be kind of a new economy, right, for gaming. But what I'm telling you is that if people charge $1,000 for a PlayStation 6, they understand that means everyone's not going to buy it. We have an influx of consumers who came into the space when prices were flat across all consumer electronics markets, and the smartphone space had this as well. There was a period of time where we had I forget what I used to call it, where we had the mid-range price high-end smartphone. And what I mean by this is we had the now I can't remember the name. We had the essential phone, right? OnePlus still kind of occupies this space, although they've raised prices too. We had LG. I would say Motorola still occupies the space. But we had other vendors in the space who were more aggressive. Asus still makes a phone. I think the only thing Asus makes, is their gaming phone now. But we had lots of vendors in the space who, for a period of time, were making flagship phones and selling them for like $500. But what it didn't have is it didn't have all the software niceties. It didn't have, they typically skipped on the camera lenses. It didn't have the AI-based software that would do all of your image enhancements and image processing. But there was a space, and then that space went away. And so people were priced out, right? In terms of people were priced out of being able to obtain a flagship phone for $500. And so people had to either move upstream and pay the higher cost of the $1,000 smartphones, or they had to buy the low-end phones like a Motorola and not get and sacrifice, compromise even more of the niceties. I've talked about this industry being a perpetual bubble. That shows sign of potentially bursting, because the burst point comes when the affluent also hit price points where they're unwilling to buy. But the question is going to be, when is that breaking point? And I don't know. We also have, as part of this conversation, content creators, not just content creators, but lots of people who shout at large volume, we need more AA and we need indie. But what I've said repeated times before is, I talk about those Steam metrics. And Joseph Ferris said the same thing on an interview with Christopher Dring. Like, we shouldn't look at Expedition 33 and proclaim that we need AA and indies are the way forward, because what that ignores is the thousands of other AA and indie games that came out that nobody gave a shit about and nobody spent money on. People are not buying the AA and indie games at scale. We have a few breakout hero projects that are doing well. We have a single-digit percentage point in the increased probability of the chance of those things being successful and being breakout hits. But you're still dealing with the very micro, small percentage chance that a thing is going to be a hit. People are not buying the AA and indie stuff at scale. What they are doing is they are buying the AAA stuff, and they are waiting for it to go on sale. And that is why those metrics are what they are on Steam. Because a game like Command and Conquer Remastered Collection comes out of nowhere, shadow drops on a day on Steam, and obliterates anything in its path that's AA or indie. Because people will still pay for a remaster or a reissue of a AAA game, and they will make that choice and buy that as a preference over a AA or an indie title. And those things keep getting made by suppliers, and I get it. Some content creators are mad because they said the industry was going to go a certain way, and suppliers have decidedly in the last few months exhibited behavior and made decisions that's absolutely opposite of what they predicted. I get it, so they're upset. The AAA stuff keeps getting made. The exclusives keep getting made because the whales buy it on day one. And I'll even extend that to day plus 30 or day plus 180. And then the stuff goes on sale, and then people still continue to buy it. Look at the sell-through. Look at the incredibly ridiculously long retail tail of God of War Ragnarok. Look at what is becoming the retail tail of Spider-Man 2. Despite the fact that we have content creators saying that nobody cares about Spider-Man 2 and people aren't buying it, it continually pops up with a chart on NPD every other month because it's having a ridiculously long commercial retail tail of where there's sell-through. Okay, so I'm gonna hit a couple more chat things, and I think I gotta get out of here. Okay, yep. So that's where we are. So look, again, I'll just reiterate one of my personal points. When you have content creators, large content creators, the burden I'm putting on your shoulders and the accountability that I'm saying you should step up to is that, particularly when you're in videos constantly saying, this is my opinion on gaming and I'm allowed to have it, then for Christ's sake, allow other people to have their opinion on gaming. And if you have a conflict with someone, if you have a disagreement with someone, probably can actually really lead to a really enriched conversation that is much more valuable than a lot of the surface strafing and astroturfing that we get in the gaming content creation spaces. If you would just be willing to like drop the martyrdom, stop with the ad hominems, and actually just have a conversation with another content creator on the objective merits of the case. And maybe stop making this about character assassination and about, I don't know, whatever else the YouTube, Twitter, gaming space is, and actually having, like I said, enriched, granular conversations that are really of value to people who are trying to be students of the industry. So that's my sermon for tonight. I apologize. I'm sure there are lots of people who are going to be mad and angry and not like, the things that I had to say, but, those are the things that needed to be said. In my gaming opinion, every console needs quick resume features. Yeah, it's a funny thing. I've literally never used quick resume. I don't think I've even tried it to test it. I think maybe one time I had to run out of the house because I was being yelled at about being somewhere on time, and maybe I used it, but I just generally don't use it. I'm old school and old fashioned. I think I've mentioned it before. I'm an adult. I shut my I stop my software and I shut my consoles down when I walk away. So I was talking to Brap earlier this week because he doesn't. He was having a problem with his gaming keyboard because he doesn't switch the power supply switch off when he shuts down his PC. And I'm like you do understand that your PC is still drawing power even for that little micro LED on the motherboard while that switch is on. So I don't know, but I always shut mine off. So thanks a lot. Really appreciate everybody joining in. I know it was kind of last minute. It dropped the notification, so I appreciate people coming through. If anybody needs to have a discussion with me about anything that I said about other content creators, you can have that discussion with me directly. So my phone lines are open. Some of you guys still have my phone number. So Thanks a lot, everybody, for joining in. If you do want to keep watching, when I go live about this stuff, feel free to subscribe to the channel so you can get a notification whenever I post new content. I think, as all of you guys know, I don't monetize, so subscribing doesn't put any money in my pocket. Like I said, it's just for your own convenience. So, but it's also so I can disarm you when you complain about not getting the notification that I was going live. So that again, and yes, YouTube notifications are often broken, but so at any rate, thanks so much for joining in for tonight. For anybody who wants to jump on and watch the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast, we'll be going live here in a few moments. So please feel free to come through and watch that show as well. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe out there, play the games that you like, come here to talk to me about the games that you love. Once again, my name has been Game Logic from the Rounding Off Infinity Gaming channel on YouTube, one of the co-hosts of the Enough to Keep Going weekly video games podcast on the E2KG Network podcasting channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for swinging by. Until next time, good night, good luck, and good gaming. That's going to do it for me. I'm out of here.